I'm joined here in the Beijing studio by Professor Wang Yiwei, who is the director of the Center for EU Studies at Renmin University of China, here based in Beijing. Welcome to our program, sir. Meanwhile, joining us from Moscow, we are having Mr. Dmitry Babich, who is a political analyst from Sputnik International news agency. Welcome. And in Washington, D.C. from the United States, we are joined by Ambassador Kurt Volker, who is the executive director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Welcome to our program as well, Mr. Ambassador. So, to the three of you, are the sanctions, or shall we say, the extensions of sanctions coming from both the EU countries and the United States, symbolic rather than anything else? Mr. Babich, what is your analysis?
Well, I think that the sanctions are not symbolic, they are quite substantial. Although Russia is learning to live under these sanctions, but still, of course, we want good cooperation, normal cooperation between Russia and the EU. Our economies are, in fact, complementary. Russia has what the EU lacks, and the EU has what Russia lacks. But the problem is that I think it would be wrong to say that Russia was the agent of change that brought about these unfortunate developments of the last 2 years. If you look at Syria, if you look at Ukraine, it was the West that initiated the changes, the revolutions. And when the revolutions turned violent, when they turned in the wrong way, and when Russia reacted, the West got angry, put all the blame on Russia, and imposed sanctions. I don't see how Russia can avoid the sanctions because, for example, in Ukraine, what the United States and the EU want is just a total re-establishment of control of the Ukrainian regime over the border between the rebel-held areas and Russia. And Europe and the United States don't notice that the Ukrainian regime does not fulfill its obligations under the Minsk agreements. There is no amnesty. There is no lifting of the blockade, of the economic blockade of the rebel-held regions. So what they want from Russia is just one-sided capitulation, just like they wanted from Mr. Assad that he just die or that he relinquish power, which is pretty much the same in Syria.
We will not let you go into the monologue because we need to have the other side to respond to your remarks. Ambassador Volker, you've been tentatively listening to your Russian counterpart. What do you make of some of the accusations? First of all, the sanctions are still serious toward Russia. Russia do not want to see those sanctions because those sanctions are not fair. The problem did not come from Russia, but rather from the West's involvement in some of the most sensitive regions, and the demands are unreasonable. Response.
Well, first off, in terms of the framework, Russia agreed with Ukraine, with Germany, with France in the Minsk process on the Minsk agreement. That has not been fully implemented by Russia. There are challenges on the Ukrainian side. They have tried to offer amnesty, but that has not worked out, and they will continue to try. They've tried to implement reforms. They have very little access to the eastern part of the country. So under those circumstances, the sanctions were imposed by the EU and the US on the condition that the Minsk agreement would be implemented, and then once implemented, then those sanctions would be lifted. There are still other sanctions that are based on Russia's annexation of part of Ukrainian territory, the Crimea, and those sanctions will remain in place as long as Russia continues to claim to have annexed Crimea. As far as the impact of sanctions, I'd say that they are intended to be substantial, but they are not as substantial as they could be. They still leave out a lot of areas and sectors that I think would be more impactful on the Russian economy. And I think that's because the West is trying to calculate. We want to send a signal that Russia still needs to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and to help bring this to a conclusion. At the same time, we're not trying to destroy Russia. We recognize that we want to see a healthy Russia at the end of all this, but we do have substantial differences over what Russia has done in Ukraine.
All right, two things. Professor Wang here in Beijing. We've seen some interesting developments as indicated in the background earlier. First of all, is Ukraine, compared to the issue of Syria, still the top priority for, let's just say, the West, including the United States and the European countries? Secondly, when we talk about the Syria issue, we've already seen the UN Security Council unanimously vote on a resolution talking about peace process beginning at the very beginning of the year 2016. And without the condition, at least in that document, to have Assad to go immediately. So many believe it is a compromise for both sides. If that big gesture can already be made, is sanction still necessary politically?
Well, firstly, I think so-called the West, maybe it's too simple to identify the situation.
Because the countries could be very different, their interests.
Particularly after the refugee crisis, I think the Europeans suffered more from the turmoil in the Middle East, Syria, mostly. The refugees come from Syria. So the Europeans are eager to calm down the situation in Syria. It's more eyes on the peaceful negotiation process. So it's easy to remove a regime, Saddam Hussein, the Gaddafi, but it's difficult to hand over the situation there. So now I think they kept the Assad's government there, and then I think it's an opportunity to negotiate, not to repeat the mistakes that led by United States attack of the Iraq and Gaddafi before. So I think for Europeans, of course, refugee crisis is more important, more urgent. For the sanctions to Russia, I think if it's difficult to cancel or suspend it because, there are many different voices. The Eastern European countries, very ideology are against Russia. At the same time, Russian content is Ukraine side violate the Minsk consensus, but Ambassador said it's a Russian side. So there's a different explaining of the reason of the situation. But I think they should work together after the terror attack in Paris that to fight against the ISIL. I think this is a hope to reach the new consensus among the
Well, we could argue that all of these sanctions, as Ambassador Volker mentioned, it's not necessarily as substantial as some of the most conservatives in the country would love to see. But certainly it is a political gesture. And therefore, Mr. Ambassador Volker, many would ask, what exactly does the United States have in mind in terms of Russia's involvement in seeking a solution in Syria? Because we all understand that Russia has very strong knowledge, information, intelligence, local knowledge and information as well about Syria. And it has been, at this moment, be able to, compared to the United States, devoting more efforts to Syria. So what does Washington have in mind in terms of Russia's role? And will this kind of sanctions help to build the U.S. Involvement on the issue more or less?
First off, I think where your guest in Beijing, I think, is absolutely right. We all ought to have a common interest in attacking ISIS and destroying ISIS. I think Russia should have that interest. Certainly we in the United States and the West do. I think all civilization has to reject that kind of terrorist ideology and brutality against civilians that ISIS represents. So that's the first thing where I think we all should agree, and that's what we would like to see Russia do, is take that fight to ISIS. Unfortunately, we have something different at the moment. What we have is a civil war in Syria that was sparked by the Assad regime killing its own people. It killed about 300,000 people thus far, a little bit less, has created 11 million displaced persons. And that conflict in Syria has led to the arming of resistance and opposition groups, most significantly ISIS and al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, that have been fighting the Assad regime. And the resistance is largely Sunni, the regime is largely Shia, so it becomes a religious conflict as well. Russia has come in on the side of the Shia. Russia has come in on the side of the Assad regime and is fighting against all of the opposition groups, but has started with those that are not ISIS. Started bombing those that are supported by the West, by Turkey, that would like to see a regime change but do not support ISIS. So we have some very fundamentally different goals as to who we are fighting and how at the moment. I think in the West and in Turkey, we believe there cannot be a solution in Syria as long as Assad remains in power, because that will continue to fuel the rebellion against him and the most extreme groups. So that is where you're right. It's a compromise in the UN resolution not to bring up those differences, but to try to focus on what we agree on. But the fact is, under the surface, there's still a lot where we disagree.
Mr. Babich, first of all, is that right when Ambassador Volker suggests that Russia support the Shia side and support the Assad regime? And secondly, was it correct for him to make this statement from your perspective about who will play a leading role in terms of trying to speed up the process of peace process, because we all know it's going to be very complicated and so many layers out there. Mr. Babich.
Well, unfortunately, I can't agree with Ambassador Volker. First, I don't agree on figures, because according even to the American press, there were not 300,000 but 250,000 people killed in Syria, and certainly not all of them were killed by the regime of Mr. Assad. I bet a huge part of that terrible casualty was done by the so-called opposition. And second, I see that there is a lack of logic in what Ambassador Volker said. He says that the Assad, the so-called Islamic State is evil, but the Assad regime brought about this evil by resisting it. If the Assad regime had fallen in the beginning, we would have secular democratic Syria. Well, if you read even the New York Times, or if you read even especially the French press, Le Figaro, you would see that the Islamists were there from the very beginning. Even during the so-called peaceful demonstrations, they were not so peaceful in Syria in 2011. There was already Muslim Brotherhood acting and a lot of other extremist organizations. And I think it's preposterous to say that Mr. Assad provoked the Islamic State into springing up. It's like saying that the Jews provoked Hitler and his terrible aggression in 1930s by the mere fact of their existence. I think it's quite legitimate to support anyone fighting the so-called Islamic State, even if that anyone is not a perfect Democrat. And in that sense, I think Russia gets some understanding from China and from other members of the international community, because people see that the United States was not successful in Iraq, the United States and the EU were not successful in Libya. Libya is shambles. What happened in all of these countries was, just a revolution supported by the West, the toppling of the government, and then there was a civil war and anarchy. And unfortunately, with Ukraine, it was the same story. There was an agreement between Mr. Yanukovych and the opposition signed on the 21st of February 2014. It was guaranteed by three foreign ministers from the EU, and that agreement was breached by the opposition hours after it was signed, and the EU never said a word of criticism about it. So
all right, we have
these events are very disturbing, and Russia is defending the principle here.
We have been hearing arguments from both sides, including very different versions of history and realities. Now come to you, Professor Wang. It is no secret. What is happening now in Syria, including what is happening now in Ukraine, is not necessarily only an issue of internal fighting. Geopolitics plays a big role over there as well. However, what is the road ahead is still unknown, because now we have this common enemy which is called the ISIL. They play a role in Syria. So the question is, who is likely to be this natural leadership, even though the peace process is likely to be handled within the UN system? Will the US do that? Will Russia do that? What kind of thing would it be when the sanctions is still being put on customarily, in a way, to follow the political tradition? Professor Wang.
Firstly, I think the Russian counterpart said very clearly that this situation is a chaos, it's anarchy. So not just blame somebody or some regime to pay for all this. I think it's a balance of power changed after, I think, Iraq war. Even we can come back to even earlier, because in Syria the majority are Sunni, but the ruling now government is Shia.
Yes,
So it's
we can have a lot of
unbalanced.
analysis about all the makeup of history and everything, but the question is, what about the road ahead with the sanctions continuing coming from the European countries and the United States against Russia, and Russia's, internal, even bigger and stronger argument about the outside trying to interfere into some of the local and regional issues. What does that mean for this so-called Syria peace process?
Well, I think who take the leading role? United Nations should take the leading role, not somebody.
It should, but we all know the geopolitics fighting within the UN system is also very strong as well.
But I think we can learn some lessons, like Iranian nuclear process, so-called 3+6. This is also works. In Syria, I think we can follow same step.
All right. About that, Ambassador Volker, of course, Iran is a very different issue for American politics. It is becoming one of the most important achievements of President Obama during his 8-year terms. Will Syria still occupy a very important position next year, which is going to be your election year, and things are going to be shaped by that, everything inside the United States?
Well, I think we face a very difficult year in 2016. Syria and the civil war continues to rage on. That has provoked the displaced persons and refugee crisis that we see now. Iran is supporting the Assad regime alongside Russia, and that risks opening up a wider Sunni-Shia conflict in the Middle East. That's a great concern. So I don't see the Syria conflict going away or diminishing. I actually see it potentially expanding, potentially to include other countries and to have greater and greater levels of casualties as long as that goes on. On the Iran side, yes, there's an agreement with Iran on certain aspects of the nuclear program, but the bottom line of that agreement is that in 10 years Iran will end up with a nuclear weapon. And what we've seen in recent weeks is Iran is working on the other parts of a weapons program, such as the delivery systems by testing missiles. So I think that's going to be a worrying development as well. And finally, we've been talking about Ukraine also, and as long as Russia continues to occupy parts of Ukraine and to support separatists there, having annexed Crimea as well,
All right.
I think that's also going to be an issue going forward into 2016.
Mr. Babich, your final words within 1 minute, talking about Russia's foreign policy priorities and where does the issue of Syria and Ukraine fall in that regard?
Well, I think that Russia will continue the same policy simply because we have no choice but to defend the principle of sovereignty of nation. We are going to resist the revolutions which are stimulated and provoked and supported by the United States and the European Union. I think in Ukraine the new regime is not successful. It is losing ground economically. Ukraine is a mess economically. So Russia will try to help Ukraine as much as it can, especially the regions which are held by rebels. Crimea will not return to Ukraine, especially under the new regime in Ukraine, which is openly nationalistic and anti-Russian. So I'm afraid the same thing will continue, and sanctions won't work because, let me remind you, sanctions, just like war, this is not diplomacy. Diplomacy is when you talk to your partner and you try to achieve common ground. Sanctions, that is pressure, that is not diplomacy.
All right, final words from you. You only got 10 seconds, sir, I have to say.
About Ukraine?
About the wrap up for the year, I guess, when we talk about the issue of both Ukraine and also Syria, your perspective.
I think Syria is the peaceful process to make the inclusive and negotiation. I think is the key to solve the problem.
We'll see how the negotiations would proceed. We're not that far from the very beginning of the year 2016. For now, I want to express my appreciation for the three of you, Mr. Kurt Volker from Washington, D.C., Mr. Dmitry Babich from Moscow, and Professor Wang Yiwei here with us in Beijing. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.